Thanks for
Hi.
joining us. My name is Rebecca Brendel, and I am the Director of Law and Ethics at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Mass General. And I found myself wondering, as a psychiatrist and a lawyer, and most of all, a parent, about how to talk with my own kids about what's been going on in Washington. And so I reached out to my great colleague, Jean Beresin, who's here with us today, who's the executive director of the Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Mass General Hospital and a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, to have a conversation about how to talk about difficult events, and particularly what happened in Washington around the certification of the election results yesterday on January 6th. So welcome, Jean. It's so good to be here with you. And maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about the Clay Center and what the project is and what you've been doing.
Sure. The Clay Center for Young Healthy Minds at Mass General Hospital is an educational online resource to support the emotional, social, cognitive, and behavioral well-being of youth and families. It's geared largely towards parents, but about a third of our audience, I would say, would be teenagers and young adults. We have a website that has close to 400 blogs on all different kinds of topics, from psychiatric to social issues, social topics. We have a podcast. We're going into our fourth year for podcasts, and we're up on iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and Spotify. And then we have a YouTube channel, MGH Clay Center, that has a large number of videos. So there's a lot of resources that you can access through the Clay Center. We've been around since 2013.
That's great. And we're very much looking forward to your publication coming out imminently with this, of a blog about talking to kids about what happened in Washington. And what can you tell us just in general about some general?
So yeah. I mean, when we think about how to talk to kids about events like this, I like to think about it. One, what are all kids of all ages concerned about? And then how we tailor our approach to preschoolers, to school-age kids, that's like kindergarten through sixth grade, and then to teenagers and young adults. Because the language we use and the kinds of information they can process is different. But in general, all kids want to know three things. Am I safe? Are you, the people taking care of me, safe? And how is an event like this going to change my daily life? We can assume that kids of all ages have seen scary images, have heard conversations, have heard about the invasion of the Capitol in various different ways and with varying amounts. But I think we should assume that kids of all ages have seen a bunch of things that are terrifying. Well, they're terrifying to adults too, and some of these principles, by the way, apply to adults as well as kids. But that being said, they're horrified, and we have to help them process their what feels very unsafe to them. So there are a number of general principles. All kids, first of all, need a safe space to talk, and I would say conversations should be done in an ongoing manner, starting early, and making sure that they feel safe enough to listen to you and hear you, and don't lecture them, but actually have conversations. And then we can talk about how you would have conversations at different developmental levels. A major principle is in having these conversations is controlling your own anxiety. We're all anxious about what happened yesterday.
Some of us are more anxious than others of us, in fact.
Yeah, and we all have different levels of anxiety, and we all have different levels of expressing it. There are lots of resources on the Clay Center for controlling anxiety, but all of the research has shown that when you speak with your kids, and when we speak with each other, anxiety is contagious. It cuts through everything, and it also influences the way we present material. If we can control our anxiety through diet, exercise, meditation, yoga, you name it, there's so many ways of doing it. But presenting conversations and being a part of them, especially with kids, if we take the anxiety out of the equation for the most part, it's very, very helpful in having conversations. And another important tip is if your kids are picking up on it and they ask you about it, be honest. Say, yeah, I am worried. And if they ask you what you're worried about, again, we can get to different developmental levels, but just say that you're worried, but then provide reassurance. A third principle, which is really important, is listen. Listen, listen, listen. Because you can't help support kids in any terrorist situation. And this is domestic terrorism. Unless you know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what their concerns are, and what they're worried about. So just listen and ask questions about what's going on with them, and then you can help manage their concerns and you know what to address. Don't assume that you know what they're worried about. I mean, for example, a preschool kid might be worried about rioters storming his or her house. And you can respond any way you like, but you might want to say, well, our house isn't very important to people like this, or something.
But it might not be important to society.
Yeah, I mean, right? And then they might say, well, what about my school? That's a big building. Well, the group, and again, this is for younger children. The group that invaded that building, that you don't want to use the word invaded. The group that attacked that building and is not interested in schools, so you don't have to worry about that. So, in other words, if you know what's on their mind, you can help correct it.
So you started us out there with preschoolers, and I'm just wondering, in terms of contextualizing for preschoolers in big terms, why this is separate from their immediate safety and their immediate concerns and the concerns really of their everyday life. Are there other things for preschoolers that we should be thinking about?
Yeah. Preschoolers. There are going to be a lot of issues that we'll talk about with teenagers. Justice and free speech and right to assemble and all those good things that teenagers are excited about. But preschoolers really react to your emotions more than anything else. They need reassurance, they need calming, they may need a little extra TLC. If they see that you're anxious, they may regress. They may want to sleep in your bedroom if they know that something is up. And for preschoolers and school-age kids, turn off the media, because a preschooler that sees the same images over and over again, and this was true in 9/11, they thought the buildings were being knocked down all the time. I mean, and they have no idea of how far the Capitol is to their home in Boston or San Diego or you name it. I mean, for all they know, it's like right down the street. So media overload, actually for all of us, can be too much and too alarming, but especially to the preschoolers and to the school-age kids, just turn it off as much as you can.
So that's really helpful. So really for all of us, limiting our exposure, focusing and being attuned to our own anxiety and the verbal and nonverbal signals that we're giving to our kids,
Right.
and really taking the temperature on that.
Right.
Really
Right.
So then if we're going to move on to kind of school age kids, right? What you've told us a little bit about that. What what else should we be considering?
Well, school age kids. Uh, I'll talk more about the generalities, and I can address that, but address some of those things. But school age kids are very concrete, black and white. Um, there are good guys and there are bad guys. There's life and there's death. They're not able to process the nuances and the abstractions that teenagers can. So, for example, they need the reassurance that what happened yesterday was just terrible. But there are more good guys out there than there are bad guys that are doing nasty things that are illegal, and they're learning to help us and to prevent this from happening again. So you want to reassure them that that the good is going to override the bad. You also, school age kids also work things through by play. So if they play policeman or National Guard or first responder and save people's lives over and over and over again, some parents might think, "Oh my gosh, they're going to increase their level of anxiety." It actually reduces their anxiety for them to play and play and play. And again, and their questions are going to be repetitive. Don't worry about repetitive questions with school-age kids because they need to hear things over and over again. And just plan on frequent conversations. If they're anxious to begin with, they may respond with physical complaints like stomach aches or headaches. They may have some trouble sleeping. There are warning signs if they're having trouble. And the other thing is, particularly with younger children and with teenagers, your kids the best. Some of your kids who are intrinsically anxious or get depressed or shut down or tend to explode impulsively, you can tailor your conversation to the traits that your kids have, and that way it makes it a lot better.
So that's really, really helpful, is that on the one hand, we want to reduce exposure, but we don't want to shut down conversations or reassurances that kids might need from us.
No, I and again, we'll get back to this, but helping our kids learn to be resilient, helping our kids to learn that bad things are going to happen in the world, and they have. Whether it's been the terrorist acts or the wildfires or the mudslides or you name it, the pandemic. This has been a tough year. Okay, they need to know that there are ways of addressing these issues and asking questions about it and having conversations about it and using narratives. So for example, for kids of all ages, remember when the hurricane struck and the tree fell on the house? And remember we didn't have power for a few days. Or remember when the pipes broke in the basement and we were flooded? Or remember sadly, when we lost a dear relative. We got through it. Now, you're going to say that differently to a preschooler and a school-age kid and a teenager, but those are the kinds of conversations. If you start early, the kids will have the expectation that you're the kind of parent that they can come to and they can talk with. If you try to sweep it under the rug, or you're too anxious or too preoccupied with your own concerns, they're not going to come to you, and you're not going to know what's going on with them. So that's an important principle.
Right. So we've alluded to this a little bit, and my own kids are teenagers, and moving on to teenagers, they have quite a lot to say, and lots of ideas that are in different forms of development about how they understand the world and how they understand themselves, and how do we do the listening and try to do some of the talking to help them along.
Yeah, well, let me mention a few more general principles about this event because I think it applies mostly to teenagers. First of all, that there's a right to free speech and assembly in this country. Now, school-age kids can hear this too. In other words, if you want to complain about bedtime or or schoolwork or speak up. And for teenagers, if you want to talk about what you think is fair or unfair at school or at home or in the community or in sports or in politics, as you have the right to do that. And you have the right, particularly in politics and in school, is to demonstrate, is to meet in groups, and you have the right of assembly. Now, one of the issues in this is that emotions run high in groups. Think of sporting events, think of concerts, elation, but also think of when groups get together and they're angry. So emotions are contagious, and so while we have the right to speak up, and while we have the right to demonstrate, we don't have the right to be violent. And we don't have the right to let our emotions override reason. That's the kind of conversation you can particularly have productively with teenagers because they'll get it. They can have nuanced conversations, and you can ask them, have you been in situations? You can allude to, for example, the hashtag Never Again March on Washington after Parkland, or the Women's March on Washington. Or historically, you can talk about, John Lewis and Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, and they'll with school-age kids, maybe older ones, but teenagers can understand those kinds of things. So that's important.
And then there's also, I guess, another piece of that, right? If they can understand how in certain kinds of settings they can get really emotional and have real, even think about the World Junior Hockey Finals were just on, and even the dog was running around the house screaming, right, when USA won. If they can figure out the ways in which they can control their emotions or not become overwhelmed by them in other kinds of situations, learning how to apply that to being people who could contribute to public discourse without acting out in ways that create violence or become unsafe.
Yeah, I have a blog on the Clay Center site called "Why Activism is Good for Teenagers," and they can learn to be in control. They can learn to be leaders. They can learn to be civil. They can learn to state their opinions succinctly and accept and listen to other points of view. Which is really important. There's another thing that I think that's going to be important, especially for teenagers, and that is the power of the word and social media. Without naming names, our president incited violence. And other leaders did too. Now, it may have been impulsive. I mean, I am not qualified, nor am I allowed to diagnose, and you as a lawyer know the Goldwater rule. I can't state why or how this happened, but teenagers appreciate the power of social media. They understand because about a third have been bullied, and cyberbullying is really, really powerful. And when somebody, you could say, I mean, it's always good to make an analogy to their own lives. What happens when a bully says nasty things about you and your friends? What are the consequences? And by the same token, what happens when you say something that you would rather take back? Once it's out, and it's there. So be very thoughtful about how you use social media. And a follow-up to that is asking kids, school-age kids and teenagers, where did you get your information? because what we've learned from social media is that there really are lots of sources of fake news, and conspiracy theories and things that are not valid or true. And asking and looking with them where they got their information is incredibly important, because we all need guidance. I mean, we all need guidance about where to get information that we know is truthful. In fact, one of the reasons I started the Clay Center was to help people get accurate resources in mental health, because I don't think any area in medicine is so highly stigmatized and there's so much misinformation than in mental health. Just surf the web and you're going to find all kinds of crazy stuff, and you don't know. So we need to be media literate, and teenagers especially, and adults need to learn how to be media literate, and where to get good sound information. And this can be part of the conversation and part of what we do with teenagers, and why for them, don't shut off the media. Watch it with them, and watch multiple different channels with them, and watch multiple different kinds of sites with them, and use those as springboards for discussion. And sometimes it's useful to pick resources that have different opinions, and have conversations with them, because they're able to take in these differences and be curious. We want to inspire curiosity and exploration, but we want to do it with information that's sound, valid, and not fake.
That's really great advice, not just for kids, but for adults and for all of us too. And I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with me today. And we'll hope that everyone will visit the Clay Center website,
I
where
hope so.
there's tons of information. And also look forward to some of the work you'll be doing in coming months on topics of healing and conflict resolution and civil conversation. So really so appreciative. And also people can check out other blogs and the soundtrack on the Clay Center website. So
yeah, the soundtracks to the films, because I do those. In fact, I like doing that about as much as I like writing these blogs, if not more.
that's great. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
It's important to, I think, I think the two most important things are to have conversations, and use narratives. I mean, when you think about it, all of this is part of narratives. I mean, how we got the whole history of demonstrations, the whole history of activism, the whole history of women's suffrage and the right to vote, the whole history of racism in our country. They're narratives, and just as every great spiritual tradition, whether it's Judaism or Catholicism or other groups in Christianity or the Quran, they're all based on narratives. And interestingly, all spiritual groups don't just read the narratives. They read the narratives and they have discussions about the interpretations of the narratives. And so we want our kids to actually embody that kind of learning and curiosity and exploration, so they can better process information. And it helps them understand themselves better, and it helps them understand the world better.
Well, that's a really uplifting and positive place I think we can all relate to end our conversation about this today. Thank you so much for speaking to me and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you.